Good afternoon, everybody. Hello and welcome to the Vermont Organics Recycling Summit. I am Natasha Duarte, the Director of the Composting Association of Vermont, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to the third day of the 18th Vermont Organics Recycling Summit, organized by the Composting Association of Vermont in partnership with the Vermont Agency of Natural Resources. This year's summit is being held as a kickoff event for International Compost Awareness Week, which starts this Sunday, May 5th. And that week is the largest and most comprehensive education initiative of the composting industry. This year's theme is Compost, Nature's Climate Champion. And I just want to give a call out to the poster here on the right. This is done by a student from the University of Vermont who was in Dr. Debner's Composting Ecology and Management class. And every year they, as part of that class, all the students create their own posters. And we've been partnering with them for a number of years now. So if you're interested in seeing the full collection, you can go to compostingvermont.org/VORS, that's VORS. And there's a full gallery of the posters. And if you click on the posters, you can read the students' inspiration and interpretation of this year's theme. I'd also like to thank all of our sponsors and exhibitors without whom we would not be able to put on this week-long program, especially providing the entire virtual portion free of charge for everybody. Our sponsors this year are Community Bank, Eco Products, Addison County Solid Waste Management District, AgriLab Technologies, Casella, Food Cycler, Nature Cycle, Vermont Natural Ag Products, Viably, CV Compost, the Vermont Produce Program from the Agency of Agriculture, Food and Markets, and Woods End Laboratories. So many of them are perennial, and we have a few newly added sponsors to the VORS family. So thanks again to all of them for supporting this work. Here we are, as I said, on Wednesday, May 1st. We're at the 1 o'clock session, Decoding the Compost Conundrum, Navigating Contaminants and Crafting Sustainable Solutions. And with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and invite our first speaker, Pam Bryer, to share hers and while I introduce her. So we're going to be hearing about persistent herbicides. Is that still a thing? From Pam Bryer, who is the new agrochemical toxicologist with the Vermont Agency of Agriculture, Food and Markets. In that role, she helps multiple programs assess risk from a wide array of chemical inputs. Her background is in environmental toxicology, and she has experience in academia, industry, and most recently in government as a science advisor to a pesticide regulatory board.
Thank you, everybody, for stopping by to attend this session. I'm excited to talk about my catharsis of the maturation in moving to this new position in Vermont. So there's a little bit of personal story worked in here. My name is Pam. I'm the agrochemical toxicologist for the Agency of Agriculture, Food and Markets. And I come to this position from being the pesticides toxicologist for the state of Maine. So there's some story here. And I really wanted to start my discussion on persistent herbicides by talking about a little bit of the bigger issue of why do we allow hazardous chemicals to be used at all? If we know that they can cause a hazard, why are we still using them? And so, as way of backstory, right, I said I was the pesticides toxicologist. When I got to the state of Maine in that role, I had a PhD in environmental toxicology, and I knew contaminants. So that's the study of pollution and how it moves through the environment. And I absolutely thought that I was going to save Maine from pesticides, because everything I knew about pesticides came from the popular press. And pesticides is a really niche field, really detailed. And I've essentially had to give up reading popular press articles because it's just, and again, I'm going to get to part of that in my presentation. Too often there are too many inaccuracies. So what I do is I'm a risk assessor for the state, right? So I'm going to be looking at the role of chemicals and their potential for causing harm. And in risk assessment, we use this thing called the risk equation, which is on the screen. The risk is always a mixture of how the exposure to the chemical goes and how hazardous that chemical can be. And in pesticides, we know that all pesticides have hazard. In fact, if there's a pesticide out there that isn't causing the effect that it is intended to, like my agency should pursue that, because that's consumer fraud, right? Like you buy these things to cause an action. And I don't care if that's vinegar to disinfect your kitchen table, all pesticides have this hazard that they carry with them. But hazard exists on a continuum. And the world's most poisonous or toxic chemical is actually a naturally occurring chemical produced by this bacterium. And it's a natural chemical. And again, it's the thing that can drop a human the quickest, the smallest concentration to kill a person. People die every year in the United States because of this chemical, and many are hospitalized. And at the same time, we take this and we inject it into our skin to take care of wrinkles. You know, from a risk assessment and control standpoint, that's wild. But what people have figured out that trust this process is that they can inject it into their forehead and it's not going to travel to their lungs and travel to the heart and stop their heart. And they're not going to breathe it out and kill their friends, right? Like they understand the movement through that ecosystem of the body. And on the other end of this spectrum is one of those chemicals we consider to be the least harmless, water. This list of symptoms I took from a chemical database that I use when I'm looking up details on chemicals. And these are symptoms that people suffered from their doctors administering too much water. And some of these people died. And so I know I get accused of being a corporate shill when I do the water is toxic too. But water is toxic too. And as a risk assessor, this is what you have to do, is you have to look at all chemicals. You know that at any point, there's not one chemical that will always be safe. And there's also the flip side of that. If we act like adults, we can use the world's most toxic compounds in commerce successfully. And that kind of is, you know, the theoretical underpinning, I think, of why pesticides are allowed to be used in society. So when you think about pesticides, we know they're going to have hazard, but we think a lot about exposure. And those are the parts of the science that get me really excited, is about the modeling and the fate of movement through the environment. And that kind of brings us to this sticky issue of persistent herbicides. So there are about 900 active ingredients available for commerce, and there's a small group of them, 7 that have been identified as herbicides of concern for the potential for buildup in the environment, but persistence in the environment, and 3 specifically that EPA very closely regulates because of recurring problems in the past. So if you're growing cows or horses, you want to grow a high quality forage that consistently delivers what you think it's delivering. And one of the ways, not the only way to manage that, but one of the ways to do that kind of management is with a selective herbicide application to your pasture or field. The picture on the left shows what a selective herbicide can do. It's one of the types of selective herbicides. Here you can have a fully established grass plot. You can kill the weeds, but without killing the grass. And that's on the picture on the right, what we're doing at the very top image, right? You're going to spray the pasture, you're going to get rid of the weeds and create that desirable forage that you're gunning for. And once you have that, a couple things can happen. You can directly graze your animals, or you can cut it and either feed it to the animals or use it as bedding. But when you think about it from an exposure standpoint about what's happening, you're taking this chemical that was applied over a large geographic area and you're immediately bringing it down to one spot on the farm and you're concentrating it. And we'll talk a little bit about how they degrade, but they're not degrading in those animals. And so they're passing through in this kind of more condensed form. And then the manure and the hay is going to be piled out back. And again, microbial action is going to be reducing the volume of the bigger pile to something smaller, and you're going to further concentrate those persistent chemicals. This is a picture from a label from one of the herbicides, and it's showing you, do not use this on compost, do not use this on garden vegetables. There's sufficient phytotoxicity, you will kill them. In fact, it's really a better 2-for-1 deal if you take that and spread it back on the field that you initially spread it on, where you can essentially reuse that chemical for a second. The EPA started moving towards restrictions on these chemicals about 20-something years ago. 2002 was one of the earliest dates I saw where EPA was taking action on persistent herbicides. The link here will take you to their webpage, which is this picture that I'm showing here. There's a lot of detailed docket information there, but some general stuff too. The general kind of framework for how EPA thinks about the restrictions they put on these herbicides to make sure that there are not recurring problems in compost are outlined on the right. I'm not intending on reading it to you. It's there. The slides are available. It does summarize nicely. I love reading EPA stuff. Perhaps it's because I have an 8th grade reading level, but it's there for you to nicely summarize EPA's actions to reduce harm here. So in a sense, for me, the persistent herbicides is old news, right? Like there was a problem. EPA looked at it, they changed the rules. And as a regulator, it's kind of, okay, what do we do now? It's education and enforcement, but there's still, it's not exciting anymore. It's just back to the persistent challenges we have educating and enforcing on these things. And I mentioned my struggle with my position when I took it. There was a homestead blogger who I liked quite a bit. I bought one of her books. And so when I was new to my position, she had an article that came out about persistent herbicides. And I was like excited. And that this was before I had learned to run from popular press articles. And I was really sad because the whole tone of the piece was very doom and gloom. And it wasn't that bad things happen and it's catastrophic when it does happen. And I'm not trying to minimize that. But from my perspective, is we need to educate and get the word out. People need to know that agencies like mine in every single state take this really seriously. This is a violation of federal and state law when some sort of persistent herbicide issue breaks out and harm is caused. This is what our agencies do. And so I wrote to the author and I had a few minutes of like, oh my God, she wrote back. And we had this back and forth that was really unsatisfying. For blog posts, I've since kind of figured out she puts the same article up every 9 months. And I was pushing for like, tell your people there's recourse. Tell them to talk to their state lead agency. You can get an enforcement action. They will send inspectors. You can have tests. Like there is a path forward if this happens to you. But she has not changed her tune. And I was really sad because it was an opportunity for her to help us spread the word. We have 4 inspectors in Vermont, and they can do what they can do. But the more eyes and ears that are out there for people willing to help us, the better. The better it is for everybody. A little bit of soapbox. I'll get back to some facts here. In the state of Vermont, we have 41 registered products that contain these 3 active ingredients of most concern for persistence. And I made this a little backwards. So in that first column, the first 8 of those brand names, that's the picrolam containing herbicides. The next 6, starting down with milestone in that first column, those are aminopyrrolid. And then the last 27 of those products are clopyrrolid. In order for a product to be used in the state, it has to be registered with the state. And so many chemical companies will register their products even if they don't intend on selling it, just because they could be in legal trouble if their product was found to be sold here. So this represents the entire universe of legal products to use in Vermont, but it doesn't mean you can find all of them if you were to walk into a store. It's just what is available. So those are the brand names at any rate. If you ever need to look up a brand name, there's a link. We have a database that refreshes every day for what's legal to use in the state. So trying to figure it, that's one way to figure out exposure potential. Another way is to think about what have we used. And this is the data for the most recent data we have public. And one of the things to remember here is that if you apply this to your own property, you're not required to send those data to the state. So that's not reflected here. And that leaves out a good portion of what we're talking about. very likely. But still, for what it is, you can see that picrolam does not seem to be used in Vermont. Clopyrrolid seems to be the most commonly used one, and there's definitely aminopyrrolid being used in the state. But again, these are caveated because that's not necessarily pasture. That could include any other turf use. So right-of-ways, golf courses could be included in that total. So it's they're using it, but it's still not very helpful or usable, actionable if you're trying to figure out where your feedstock comes from. I guess another way to think about the exposure aspect is looking at the specific chemicals and how long do they last. And this is where, it gets interesting for me. One of my favorite databases for this kind of information is linked at the bottom. It's maintained at a university in England, and you can find a lot of good half-life data there. So if we take the ones of concern from the EPA webpage, we can see aminopyrrolid has the longest soil half-life. And that soil half-life is, if I apply a pound today, in 35 days, I would expect there to be half a pound remaining of the aminopyrrolid. A rule of thumb that we use in toxicology is you take that number and you multiply it by 5, and you get how long does it last in the environment. It takes it through 5 half-lives. And according to that, the aminopyrrolid should be gone from the soil in 175 days. And you should be scratching your head like, well, there wouldn't be a persistent herbicide issue if it really did decay that quickly. So is it the math that's wrong? Are these bogus numbers? How do you reconcile this decay rate with this very real problem? And what this table is, it focuses on only aminopyrrolid, and that first row is carried over from the previous table. 35 days, half-life decay rate in aerobic soil. And so 35 days that's an average. It's a little conservative, but it represents a range, and nobody would ever expect it to only ever be 35 days. If you look at this table, the kind of 3 lines below, the 3 rows below that first one, where it says EU dossier, and then it's got a row for lab studies, it shows that half-life in soil ranges between 26 and 147 days. And in field studies, the range is from 4 days to 22 days. So there's a whole bunch of things to kind of take in with that data. Within a study type, there's a lot of variation. Between field studies and lab studies, we see a tremendous difference, right? Like the field studies are showing a much shorter half-life. And that's a clue as to what's happening. So we know just generically when we talk about the breakdown of pesticides in the environment, there's 3 things that control breakdown. It's going to be sunlight, water, and microbes. Those are the powerhouses that break down pesticides. So we're going to go down a little further as we kind of explore why aminopyrrolid breaks down and why it doesn't. This particular compound did not have on-plant data available, which stinks because that can be really useful to know. All of these data are required by both the EU and EPA, but the on-plant data doesn't seem to be the required component, and it's more variable. But look at the next 2 rows, sunlit water and dark water. In sunlit water, it breaks down in half a day, and in dark water, it doesn't break down. So you could just like put it in a jar on the shelf and it's going to stay there, stored nicely. That's telling you about part of the story. And think also about sunlight and the intestines of a cow. There's not a lot of sunlight in there. The bottom of a compost pile, not a lot of sunlight there. Sunlight is obviously a really clear driver of aminopyrrolid breakdown. But then that last row, the water sediment data, so that's that slurry mix, and it's really helpful when you're thinking about a stream edge or a pond edge, if the degradation is going to be happening there. And it's not. And then when you reflect on the kind of microbial community there versus in the field studies, you can really see that the main root of breakdown is the appropriate microbial community. Not any microbial community, right? Because the lumen of the cow is not doing it. But there are conditions in soil that lead to the breakdown. But it has to be those conditions, not stuff in a lagoon, not stuff in a pile, but in the soil, in aerated aerobic soil. And so that really kind of shows you can't predict where a pesticide is going to move. except by knowing exactly the active ingredient, the type of use, the rate it's going to be applied, the machinery that it's going to be applied with. And that is actually how pesticides are regulated. You don't find rules that say this pesticide can't, there's no federal law that says pesticides have to be applied 75 feet from water. And it's because some pesticides are meant to be used in water, right? Like those kind of really broad rules don't make sense in pesticides. And essentially industry put this forward so that each product is regulated on its own. But nothing really gets as close to that except medicine. And I would argue, well, we do know more about human health effects of medicine, but medicine is not tested for environmental effects. Like I can't look up the decay rates of aspirin, right? That's not known, but we do have that for pesticides. And so each pesticide product has a label, and pesticide applicators have to follow that label. I think this is where the biggest chasm, and I think it's part of the story with persistent herbicides, is that for you and I, there are no major repercussions if we don't follow a pesticide label. It's not our business. But a pesticide applicator can lose their license. So to become a licensed applicator, you have to take written tests. You have to take continuing education courses. You have to submit records to the state. You have to open yourself up to inspection. So there's a lot for them to lose if they violate the pesticide label. And if you're ever wondering if you're holding a registered pesticide in your hand, you'll see this statement on it that says directions for use. It is a violation of federal law to use this product in a manner inconsistent with this labeling. You'll see this on disinfectants in your home and with insect repellent. Both of those are classified as pesticides at a federal level.
You've got about 4 minutes, Pam.
Okay, perfect. So I have 3 example labels. Clopyralid. If you ever need information on a product, go find the EPA registration number, ask the applicator. It's going to get you to the exact product you need. And if the applicator's records were to show that they were treating for spotted knapweed, but that they used a rate of half a fluid ounce, that's a violation. That's the kind of thing that our agency follows up on. So it's very detailed what is on the label, and it must be followed exactly. Another example for picrolam. This label is 18 pages long. You often hear labels are too confusing. I think that's for homeowners. Applicators understand that we have a network of helping them understand pesticide labels and that they have to read the whole thing. They have to understand the whole thing. If you think you see somebody who is not wearing the proper PPE, you can get a copy of the label. You'll see on the label what the applicator is supposed to be wearing. And by all means, let our agency know if people are not following these rules. These are important that they all are followed all of the time. Here are some of the rules for this product with regards to compost. And you can see it gets pretty specific. Don't use grass or hay from treated areas for composting. Oh, it's kind of, don't use it for feed crops. Don't use manure from this area in certain locations. The aminopyrrolid label. So I am running out of maybe a little bit of time. Aminopyrrolid is the active ingredient that I think Vermonters know most about, because there was a really famous incident in 2012 where this product was used inappropriately and caused a massive incident. I guess we'll say 600 different gardens were affected, and the composter really, had liability of close to $1 million. So this is not a small issue, and our agency does take it really seriously. Right on the front of this label, grass from this that has been treated with this product in the preceding 18 months can only be used on that same farm, right? Like this label also has the diagram to show you really basically, don't use this on compost. Don't use this on vegetables that are going to be susceptible. The owner of this particular brand decided that the liability was too much, and they put on their label this map. And if you are in one of the gray states, you are not allowed to use this product on pasture. Essentially, that once it's on the label, that's enforceable by our agency. And the one, I think, last important bit about labels, this brings up is about testing. So companies have to submit a method to test their product when they register. But that doesn't mean that it's going to be easy for you to get that product analyzed for. This label even indicates the best way to tell if you should grow your crop on the soil is to test your crop on the soil. And the one thing I would put in your mind, even with advancing analytical capabilities, is that the roots are going to spread through the soil sample, and they're going to be able to really effectively sample a large area in a way that it may not be able for you to sample your field as well. So bioassays really are, if that's what you want to know, a bioassay is always going to give you better information than a chemical test. I'm new to the agency, and I myself didn't know how to report an incident. So these are the steps. Go to our homepage, scroll down. The tricky part, you have to figure out where the pesticide division is, and we're in public health and agricultural resource management. When you get to the pesticide part, click on pesticide programs, and finally, when you're on the pesticide programs page, you scroll down and we have a link. We have an electronic form that you can use. There's some required bits, like where it happened and what happened. You can see we have an emphasis. There's a button there to say this is a composting problem. And I think most importantly, you can do this anonymously. If you have to do it anonymously, to make sure that we get that message, that is available for you. Also, if electronic forms are not your thing, just call us. Our wonderful admin will make sure your call gets where it needs to go, or your email. And with that, I'm happy to take any questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Pam. We have time to take maybe one question before moving on, and that's just to make sure that each of our speakers has time, and then hopefully we will still have time at the end to have conversation. But are there any burning questions right now? And you can also think about that. Okay, Carrie, yep, go ahead.
Happy to fill in with a question. Pam, welcome to your position. I'm sorry for you. Have you so are you aware of persistent herbicide outbreaks, for lack of a better term, or incidences either in Vermont or nationwide that have made the news? So, your headlines, is that still a thing? What other situations are you aware of recently, either locally or otherwise?
So we've had a big changeover in the agency. And so we don't have like a record since the 2012 of an incident in Vermont that I could tell. I'm not in enforcement, so I don't have like full, but asking the folks that are there now. And I did ask my boss, who's been in this business for about 100 years. Don't tell him I said that. But he had the same basic memory. Like once there was this horse farm, right? Like that was down in Florida. That it's not this recurring thing. But I fear that we don't know this, right? Like if people don't know that it's against the law, they're not going to pursue action, or maybe they're protecting a friend or whatever it is. So that's part of the reason I'm also interested in being here is if it is happening, I would love to know. Like this is a discussion that works both ways.
Great, thank you. We are going to go ahead and move on to our next presenter. Kevin, I'm going to invite you to start sharing your screen while I introduce you, just to save a little bit on time. Our next panelist is going to be talking about solutions for removing microplastics from depackaged food organics. Kevin Pedretti has been working in and around food waste recovery and organics pre-processing since 2013. In his role as business development manager for Scott Equipment, he specializes in process development for organics recovery equipment, including depackaging machines. One of those leading families of machines, the Turbo separator, was introduced in 1993 and has sold over 400 units around the globe. At their headquarters in Minnesota, they continue to develop new processing equipment for the challenges in the industry, like addressing microplastics. And so with that, Kevin, feel free to share your video if you want to. If you haven't, I don't see you there yet. And I look forward to your session. Take it away.
Hello, everybody. Thanks for allowing me an opportunity to talk about microplastics. So it's a topic that's out everywhere. So with that, I'll continue with the presentation. I will shut off my video and I'll go through the slides. So solutions for removing microplastics from depackaging food. Organics is the topic. You might have seen in the program, Natasha had done kind of a description, and I just highlighted a couple words on what we're going to be talking about today. And primarily it's about the purpose of landfill diversion of food waste is a hot topic around the globe, not just in Vermont. And also narrowing down on the depackaging systems that are available today, generically called pre-treatment systems. Are not 100% clean, as we all know. So after it goes through that process, there's still contaminants left over. And we're going to talk about the challenges that are there from equipment perspective, and then other innovative solutions that we've developed, and I'll share a bit about that. So the 4 sections: depackaging and slurry creation, purity of the organics, microplastics and challenges for removal, and then our solution that we're in the process of developing and have developed over the last several years. So source separated organics, there are some things that many people in the audience will most likely know. For those that don't, we'll just go over the mountaintops here. But source separated organics are typically found in 2 different varieties. On the left-hand side, typically I call it the dumpster collection method. So they're aggregated in some sort of container. They're brought to a facility or location in which they are then brought into a depackaging machine and then separated. The other style shows up on more of a semi-truck trailer with palletized goods. They're offloaded, and then those products are processed as well. They're uniquely different in how they interact inside of a depackaging machine, but both methods are very important to divert from landfill. Right now, depackaging and slurry creation, what's the best method? Well, manual labor has been the one way to do it, but the low throughput has always been a barrier of accepting more and more organics. And as the push, like I say, to reduce greenhouse gas, looking for alternatives to take more tonnage away from landfill, and you need some sort of mechanized process, and those come in a variety of different flavors. I won't get into that today, but generically, we're just calling them depack machines. So how a depack machine typically works is there's some sort of a hopper. This is an example of a typical grocery store, mixed grocery store load, where you have expired goods that are collected, transported, and then delivered in this hopper, letter A. It goes through the separator, which is letter B. Our separator is called the turbo separator, and it separates those out between letter C for the organics and letter D for the packaging. So the slurry that's collected depends so much on the incoming material. So the dirtier the material is, or when I say dirtier, the more contamination that there is, the consistency of the organics can change dramatically. It can be thick like a dirt, like a clumpy dirt, black dirt, or it can be runny and thin if you're processing a fair amount of beverages or produce. But I would say overall, what you're looking at on the screen is pretty typical across the board of, let's say, grocery store waste or expired goods that you'd have from a food shelf or things like that. Organics purity is, the market desire is to get to greater than 99.5% clean organics. I would stop short to say that I would say the needle is even tipping to 99.8 right now for some wastewater treatment facilities. That's kind of their standard. And in the end, majority of this goes to potentially land apply. So whether it's for animal nutrition, hogs, cattle, They eat the recovered food, whether it's cookies or bakery or whatever it is. And then the manure is generated, and either that manure goes in holding ponds, but in the end, that manure could contain some contaminants in it. And so what we do with that. Same with compost, same with digesting. We talked about throughput manual, but it also has implication on purity. So when you depackage by hand, it's extremely slow, but the output is extremely clean. Vice versa, if you run it through a machine, we still get 99% clean organics that come out of the machine. But if you think in terms of tonnages per day, if you process it for a particular site, which is pretty common, processes 100 tons per day, 1 ton of that could potentially be contamination. So out of that 1 ton or 2,000 pounds, it could be corrugated paper fiberboard, which is pretty inert and okay for land. But a lot of the other ones, rigid plastics, film plastics, produce labels, rubber bands, foils, glass, all these things, most locations, this is what we're trying to get out. So 99% is not good enough. So out of that contamination on the right-hand side, US, and as far as that goes, the world, we're addicted. We're addicted to plastic. We're addicted to convenience. We're addicted to how our food gets transported from coast to coast. We're addicted to on the shelf, I want an avocado, but avocados don't grow in California in the winter, so we pull them all the way from Peru. And then we want them fresh on the shelf, and unfortunately that demand, or that pull of demand, creates a lot of waste. And the only way that they can mitigate that waste is to wrap it and protect it and add a bunch of packaging. And that's what we've created, this monster based on our demand. The definition of microplastics is anything less than greater than 1 millimeter. Anything less than 1 millimeter is considered a nanoplastic. So for the sake of this presentation, we're just going to focus on microplastics. We know that next topic here, microplastics and challenges removal. We know that, on the compost side of things, there's a picture in the middle of the screen there. We know that when you take in green waste, you take in food waste, and the traditional method of shredding and trommeling, there's still a fair bit of contamination that's in the compost process during the breakdown process. So even when you screen at the end, there is plastics, especially microplastics in the end. So the idea is to remove those things ahead of time. That's number one. And then even post-process, after you have this quote-unquote clean slurry that might be 99.5% clean, to drive and to strive for that 99.9 or better. So many years ago, 2014, Nora Goldstein from BioCycle had said, she had pointed out and brought up, and she goes, Kevin, if Scott Equipment could only come up with a machine that could take out produce labels, that would really help the compost industry. And that stuck in my mind. And so I went back to our Santa's workshop and shared with the team that the market needs this. So we started to noodle on how we could, as an equipment manufacturer, how we could create something that could take out something as small and innocuous as a small produce label. And I call it many needles in the haystack. So we developed a machine, and 3 years ago we started to solicit some slurry from some of our customers, and we had the slurry dropped off at our test lab in Minnesota. And on the left-hand side, we started to take that stuff out of the IBC tote, and it's what you see on top of the left-hand photo here. There's a lot of floaters, so don't look at that and go, oh my goodness, that's not 99% clean. It's when we transport a lot of those plastic, we call them floaties, they floated to the top, but still it's contamination. It's very visual, it's very in your face. We ran it through our prototype machine, and lo and behold, it took out amazing stuff. It took out exactly what we intended for it to take out. We have a before and after. There's a picture of the barrel of stuff. What you're looking at there, this was a mixture of ketchup, mustard, and relish. So we got the very beautiful colors there. If you ever noticed on a ketchup and mustard top where you have the flip top, you also have these rubberized, they're almost like rubberized spouts. Those also came out in the mix. And so that led us to start to qualify or quantify into 4 different areas organics, because we want to be able to classify these. So when we're talking in an audience like this, or people have different feedstocks across North America, we wanted to be able to put them in one of these different quadrants. So we broke them into A, B, C, and D. A being pourable, straight pourable liquids, beverages, oils, and AD effluent. Our marking system is we feel that those are 5 out of 5 star applications at the moment. The machine works extremely well for that type of material. Letter B, which you just saw an example of on the screen, the prior screen, semi-pourable liquids, yogurts, ketchups, ice creams, things that pour out of a cup quite easily without dilution, maybe possible dilution. They work fantastic. Then we step down to mixed commercial, where you might get a mixture of raw meats, vegetables, floral, anything out of a grocery store, anything out of an institutional, maybe a baseball stadium, or so on and so forth. We're tentatively, we're putting it at 3 star right now. We're still being conservative. Some runs we have done, it's 5 out of 5 star, but right now we're hunkering down at 3 star to be not too full of ourselves. There's more testing required in this quadrant. And then quadrant D is more, think of like fat soluble type stuff. Fats, when you add, specifically when you add cold water or any kind of cold to them, they tend to gel, and those things do not typically go through screens very well. So that is not recommended. That's an area that we would not process through this machine that we're going to talk about in just a bit. So I'm going to go through some different examples. I'll show you different examples. It's a video right now of what the technology can do. Again, we're focusing back. The 35,000-foot view is to take microplastics out of organics so that they do not end up going into the ground, going onto land apply. And so these are some examples of some of those products. Quadrant A, beverages, shampoo, melted ice creams. You can see some popsicle sticks. So depackaging machines only have certain size screens, and what happens is dimensionally, if something is small in diameter but long in length, some of those items can dart through the screens and they end up showing up in the slurry, and this machine effectively takes out those types of contaminants. When we tested for AD effluent at a beta site, at a biodigester, they wanted to be able to run it after their digester and run their digestate through there. And so what you're seeing on the right-hand side, a little bit of a crude setup because it was temporary, but the can, we're going to zoom up on the can here in a second, but what it's pulling off is out of that broth, out of that AD effluent that is about less than 10% solids, it is pulling out all the contamination of that AD effluent. Well, I stopped short of saying all the contaminant. It's getting it extremely clean. The picture that you see on the left is prior, and then the video you see on the right is after. It does an amazing job on that. And if we look at the digestate itself post dewatering, what you don't see, which is most important, is you don't see any colors. You don't see reds, whites, blues, typical to packaging. And so after that dewatering press shows what they use it for bedding, but it could also be land applied if it was a compost situation. Stepping into quadrant B, the semi-pourable liquids. Again, this is an example of some ketchups or mustards on the left-hand side. So after the depack process, this is typical. They're throwing in whole pallets of expired or near expired or damaged institutional sized yellow mustard. And that generated microplastics that went into the slurry. This example is of yogurt. This is in our test lab. What you're seeing on the left is during the depackaging process. The slurry itself looks relatively clean and good, but upon inspection and going through the clean sweep process, we find that there's all these little tiny pieces of plastic that were generated from what you see on the left. So what tends to happen with these containers, number 5 plastic, is that when they get cold or frozen or altered, and Vermont is in a northern climate, they become fragile and they shatter very easy. So it's very difficult to process or depackage these, but through the clean sweep, we are able to get extremely clean organics. Post-testing, so here's what it pulled out. And if you notice, it was strawberry yogurt that we processed, and without using any water, that's what the plastic looks like. It's very clean. It's free-flowing in your hand. It's also pulled out extremely small items, as you can see in the photograph here. So very clean yogurt. We ran it through a 1 millimeter sieve with hot water to see what we had left. We tapped all that out, shook it, weighed it on our scale. And so we ran multiple tests and we all got in the 99.9 plus category.
You've got about 3 minutes, Kevin.
Okay, I have lots of slides to go. All right, another test that we did was with ice cream. Very clean results with ice cream. It pulled all the nasties out and kept the ice cream. We did other lotions and creams. You can see on the right-hand side all the things that it pulls out. Here's an example of lotions and creams. Look like a mashed potatoes afterwards. Then we went to grocery store waste, quadrant C. And so in grocery store waste, there's a lot more pith and stalks and seeds with the produce. So you think of like a stalk of celery. Celery is a majority water, but there's some stalks and sticks. And so it pulls those out. It also pulls seeds. It also pulls all the other packaging that's in there. And so you saw the video in the lower right corner. Extremely clean, again, 99.9% clean. It's hard to even measure what's left in terms of contamination. It's pulling all the produce labels out. It's pulling all the rubber bands, thin films, little balls of metal foils, peel back foils. One thing it has a difficulty or had a difficulty doing is in the fall. We got a load of organic slurry of a supermarket waste variety, and it tended to plug the screens because of all the corn husks that were in that load. There was bags of just corn husks, and they blinded over the screens kind of like paper mache. So we added brushes inside the machine, and so that's helped minimize that. And then last, quadrant D has to do with more fatty things, fat soluble type stuff. Here's an example of some meat product that we put in. It was turkey. Clean Sweep also did a very good job pulling out the right hand photo. You can see these are number 7 plastics. They're called other, but it's a conglomerate of different plastics. But again, pulled all those out and also pulled out the rubbery bits that kind of on the outside of a turkey breast. And when we took the slurry, squeezed the water out just for testing sake, the turkey came out extremely clean. Again, we couldn't find detectable contamination. And then last D, other fat soluble stuff like dog food, not recommended. It blinds the screens and again, not recommended. So for more information, there's our website. I'll share this with Natasha, the presentation. Again, we are the manufacturer. This product is for sale now. We have sold six units, and all 6 of them are in a variety of process of being put into operation across the United States.
Great. Thank you so much, Kevin. Perfect timing.
Good.
So we do have time for a couple questions. One clarifying question that I received was if you could, and maybe you said this, but is the clean sweep like a process or an add-on after material has gone through a depackager, or is it actually integrated in? So depackaging equipment now do the depackaging and just is it like an inherent part of that full process?
Great question. So yeah, it is an add-on. So it's a standalone separate process that can be integrated to either at the depackaging process. It could be at a wastewater treatment plant or biofacility that is accepting a bunch of different slurries that are all commingled together.
Mm-hmm.
Before it's dosed into a digester, or it can be placed I know this is a composting talk, but it can go to after anaerobic digestion as well, and that example of the effluent.
Great. And a sort of a follow-up question, Emma asks if there are plans to add the clean sweep technology to new depackagers. So do you foresee this becoming an integrated step?
No, we see it decoupled only because there are some things, let's say the client or the user has a quadrant 4 material and they want to be able to bypass this process. It's much easier to bypass. So basically, in order for this machine to work, it has to be able to pour out of a cup unassisted. So we can process thick chili or runny thick chili consistency that'll go through the machine. But it has to be pumped in and pumped out. Okay.
Great. And we have a question about pricing. So with thinking of this as an add-on, can you give us a sense of the cost for adding this on?
Depending on what features you purchase, it's in the price range between 100,000 and 200,000, depending on what you get with it. So with that price, you get a clean sweep unit, you get controls, you get a pump. It just depends on whether or not you want discharge conveyors to take the microplastics, the small stuff, and how far you want to transport it. And then what your volume is, so sizing the pumps correctly.
Great. And just a quick follow-up question on that. Can you give us an idea of that relative expense to a depackager? So if, is it a small add-on, or is it, I'm not sure everybody in the audience knows how much just getting into a depack machine costs.
Yeah, there's small, medium, and large. I would say you're anywhere from 10% to 25% the cost of a depackaging machine.
Okay, great. That's super helpful, just having context. So although I personally have several more questions for you, Kevin, I am going to hold them, and I haven't seen any others necessarily come in, but I think we're going to move to our third and final speaker in the session. And then hopefully have a little bit of time for some more conversation afterwards. So our next and final speaker is going to be talking about PFAS in compost. How does it get there and what can be done? Our presenter is Caleb Goossen, who started as the organic crop specialist for the Maine Organic Farmers and Gardeners Association, or MOFGA, in 2018 after receiving his PhD in agronomy from the University of Vermont. Prior to that, he farmed for 9 years in Vermont, worked at Vermont's oldest nursery, and had brief horticultural adventures in Belize and New Zealand. So thank you so much for joining us, Caleb. We're really looking forward to hearing from you and some more about the PFAS situation.
Great, thank you. Just because I tend to go on a lot, and this is a very large topic, I'm going to just try to be as quick as I can. So why am I here? An agronomist, work with an organic farming association in Maine. Folks, I think probably have heard a little bit about this. If not, Google PFAS in Maine, and you'll see lots of news items that have popped up. And so it, particularly in 2022, when these headlines are pulled from, it really entered the public conversation quite a bit, although it's been a growing topic of conversation. One thing we can't really get into the real ins and outs of PFAS. There's thousands and thousands of these compounds, potentially 12, 14,000 plus, depending on what definition you use. And different entities use different definitions of what PFAS are. That's one important thing to keep in mind. But in general, the carbon-fluorine bond is the strongest single chemical bond we know in organic chemistry. It's what gives these PFAS compounds the source of being incredibly useful for lots of things, but unfortunately also incredibly persistent. For microbes, the juice isn't worth the squeeze to break that carbon-fluorine bond. They're not going to get enough energy out of it. So among the oldest and best studied PFAS compounds, ones that we know have health consequences, that industry has known since at least the 70s, and the general public has been knowing more and more since late 90s, 2000s, are PFOS, PFOA. Here's an example of the molecular diagram of what they are. But basically, no, it's a chain of carbons, and instead of hydrogens, where like you might see in a fat, you have fluorines. So they're saturated with fluorines, and then they have a head group at the end. So PFOS, it's a sulfonate, and that gives it slightly different characteristics than PFOA, which is a carboxylic acid. In general, you can't generalize, right? All of these compounds are going to behave a little bit differently. They're going to move through soil differently. Some sorb more strongly to soil. They're all soluble in water, and yet they're also hydrophobic. There's lots of like conundrums, right? It's hard to wrap your head around it. And I'm also going to be overgeneralizing, and of course, there's more to all of these things. But you should know that these ones have mostly been phased out of commercial production. However, the legacy of their production we're still dealing with, as well as some other reasons why we're still dealing with these ones in particular. They're the two big ones that really drive the news. But you should also keep in the back of your mind that these are the oldest ones, and there's many, many more. And so we're kind of like playing catch up in a regulatory sense and in an understanding and research sense with where industry has gone. Potential human health effects of PFAS, like as a group, but again, it varies very much. The ones that really, of course, get our eye, if you can see my cursor here on the right, increased risk of certain cancers, as well as a lot of other potential things. What has been driving a lowering level of what levels of exposure that we know to have impacts on human health is better understanding of them as endocrine disruptors, and really a lot of it came from this decreased vaccine response in children. So just having pretty low levels of exposure to these compounds. And I'm going to particularly focus on PFOS and PFOA, those older ones, as examples. But of course, remember, they're often co-occurring, but they're also not the same as what they're co-occurring with. So these compounds leave our bodies very slowly, at least these larger ones, these older ones, and therefore very small exposures can build up over time, and you can get these health consequences. So, like I said, we're doing sort of regulatory catch-up. Some of the ones that we've known more about, this is a great graph. It's very reassuring that, when I grew up, the PFOS in my blood was most likely a lot higher than it is now. However, unidentified organofluorines, because whenever you're trying to analyze for these compounds, you need to know exactly which ones you're looking for. And as industry has gone into many other ones, or there may be changing in the environment a little bit, depending on what they are, we have to have a lot more approaches of just, well, what are the total organic fluorines out there? Because we don't know what these compounds are necessarily. That has unfortunately been increasing in human blood. A lot of this may be pharmaceuticals. A lot of pharmaceuticals are fluorinated. And this ties back to a little bit, where do they come from? And with this topic, I get a little pulled in two directions. Yes, they're everywhere. They're in everything. We put them in everything because they're super useful. But that's not to say that we shouldn't try to reduce exposures. It doesn't mean throw in the towel. They're already in everything. It means they're in everywhere, but we're starting to figure out how to cut it out of things. Relevant to this group, however, for biosolids, household items. So there's what's in your body already and you're flushing down the toilet, but there's also what you're washing off your face, the lotion you're applying, which applies a little bit to one of those Deepak examples, what body care products you have. Many of them have PFAS in them, and that's also going down the drain, or potentially straight to a composter I hadn't thought of before. Food packaging is the other big one. Both just the contact that's been with the foods, and maybe some has gone with the food waste, or if it's a compostable or mistakenly thought to be compostable food packaging material. One other bit, firefighting foam. Avian influenza is a big deal. It varies based on location, but oftentimes if a large chicken operation has influenza and they need to depopulate a chicken house, they use firefighting foam. And what do they do with that? They compost those cadavers with manure, right? Hopefully it's staying on the farm, but also it's not, because these chemicals move around in the environment. I grabbed this example from Michigan because I like it. I did scribble out cycle though, because I don't think PFAS should be considered a cycle. They're not, they're man-made. So landfill, I know this is horrible to say to a group of composters, but like, this is how the general public thinks of us, right? You are receiving waste from residential areas and or from farm areas. You will generate leachate. If there's PFAS in your waste, it will be in the leachate. You will also generate your product, which is going to soil somewhere. And if there can be PFAS in the solids. But in general, the worst areas that we see contamination, at least in New England, tend to either be from industry directly, going up the smokestack, going down the drain into the water, or their wastewater is going to a treatment plant, as well as maybe solids. And then the biosolids coming from there are much more contaminated than they would be if they were just getting residential waste. However, those things I mentioned above, it's in our bodies, it's in our products. We are still sending PFAS down the drain, even in residential areas. So in 2019, in advance of those headlines having really taken off, but there were some events that led to some investigations. There was a change of administration. The new governor started a PFAS task force. Screening levels were calculated, which is critical to being able to address anything. Drinking water standard was finally set on an interim basis. And they started screening sludge for biosolids on the basis of how likely it was when applied at an agronomic rate to contaminate groundwater and drinking water. And the subsample of what they looked at, about 95% of the sludge in the state was above that level. That's not the really heavy, crazy contamination that drove the headlines about impacted farms. This was more general background over time. It's polluting the groundwater sort of thing. And don't try to read those screen levels right there. I made it small for a reason. So I'll try to go through this example quickly, but I think I'm typically talking to farmer groups, but I think you count as similar. We're often thinking in parts per million, right? Milligrams per kilogram. So an acre furrow slice of soil, right? What will you plow up over an acre is, you might have, and I just pulled this out of my rear end, 100 pounds of calcium per acre, just as an example. That would be 50 parts per million. Parts per million was formerly like a detection limitation for a lot of compounds. With nutrients, we're like, great, we know how many parts per million, we're happy with that. Individual PFAS in soil and other solids, food, manure, compost, are typically measured in parts per billion. So 1,000 times smaller than parts per million, micrograms per kilogram. And this is partially just because of analytical constraints. When you have a complex media, lots of organic matter, the chromatography, the analysis they do in a lab has a really kind of blurry baseline. And so to actually say, yes, this is a PFAS compound and not just part of that blurry baseline, you can only go down so far. Although EPA and USDA are developing methods that are making it much smaller. So back to our example, 100 pounds of calcium per acre. That's 100 pounds of calcium per 2 million pounds of soil, give or take, in a acre furrow slice. That's where we get to 50 parts per million, which is equivalent to 50,000 parts per billion, right? So when we're talking about fertility, we're thinking in the thousands of parts per billion, to say the least. When we're talking about liquids, water, milk, we're often measuring PFAS in parts per trillion. And this would probably be true for leachate as well. And interim guidance, this is now a little old. I didn't update this part of the slide, from EPA was pushing things towards parts per quadrillion, which is yet another 1,000 times smaller. So here's the crazy math, right? Just to try to orient ourselves into units. 1 part per quadrillion is 1,000th of a part per trillion, is a millionth of a part per billion, is a billionth of a part per million in how we usually think of like fertility in the soil. And run that in reverse. 1 part per million is 1,000 parts per billion, 1,000,000 parts per trillion, 1,000,000,000 parts per quadrillion. So Maine does have some screening levels. We're just about the only state that has, well, we are the only state that has them for food. And then we have some other ones that are probably a little more built out for soils than others, although I can't say that with full confidence. And they are all built off of federal guidance. So 2009, our PFAS example, they're saying per kilogram of body weight, you know, your risk level's going up for these cancers. That's what we were thinking about then at 0.3 milligrams per kilogram. So drinking water levels should be less than 200 parts per trillion. 7 years later, actually, let's take that down quite a bit. Now we're talking about 20 nanograms per kilogram of body weight per day. And these are the levels that a lot of Maine's thresholds were calculated at previously. And some of them have been updated with newer guidance and some have not yet. 2020 CDC ATSDR further decreases what is actually putting you over a risk level threshold of some sort. And they always talk about risk. They don't say this is safe or not safe. They just say, you know, basically, the higher the level of exposure over more time, the higher your risk of anything that they're concerned of. Anything relevant. And they also started to look at some more compounds than just PFOA and PFOS. And then in 2022, EPA released their interim health advisory. They finally just this past month released a final rule for drinking water. And it's really saying 4 parts per trillion in water for PFOA, PFOS, and then they have some other levels for some other compounds. And they're still saying what we released over here, which was getting us towards parts per quadrillion, is probably true in terms of risk for human health. But there's analytical constraints. You can only test so low, and there's treatment considerations. These large drinking water plants can only do so much. So that's why we're, you know, for reasonableness, to be realistic, 4 parts per trillion for these two that are better known. So Maine's current guidelines, based off those earlier guidance, as I mentioned, there are going to be some updates most likely. They've been calculated. They have not been instituted because it's very difficult to suddenly throw out a new regulatory guidance that could be affecting a lot of business. But what I circled in red here is the food action levels. They're going to be added for yogurt, eggs, pork, spinach, lettuce, potatoes, as well as including some of those other compounds that we do finally have federal levels for. We'll come back to this screening level slide, so don't worry too much about it. So, okay, back to 2022. We've got our big headlines. Everybody is looking, and they're trying to navigate. And the conversation has evolved quite a bit back then. There was a lot of potential animosity, a lot of fear, a lot of concern. There's been a lot of more understanding and a lot of people meeting in the middle with a lot of conversations. But here's my point, right? Is it worse in Maine, or did we just start looking? If you want to look at this map from the Environmental Working Group, it's probably not just Maine. Maybe there's some specific cases that are worse in some scenarios. This is another take home that we've seen, is that with these contamination events, it's all highly site specific and farm specific. So to get back through biosolids, because I feel like we should address that. I know some people will be involved with composting them potentially. This is maybe older data, but the orange bars are biosolids coming from wastewater treatment plants in Michigan that were not industrially impacted. The purple bars are industrially impacted. The thing that I want to draw your attention to is that this axis on the left is logarithmic. So it's not going 1, 10, 20, it's going 1, 10, 100, 1,000, 10,000. And this is all parts per billion. So you could, at the best wastewater treatment plant, PFOS only, just this one compound, about 2 parts per billion. It's there. It's always going to be there. And the median level, 13 parts per billion. It seems reasonable-ish enough. But the industrially impacted biosolids are pulling the average way up to almost 200 parts per billion. And you can see that some of these are above 2,000 parts per billion in the sludge. One of the worst cases in Maine, one of the worst sources of the contamination was probably even higher than that historically. So just for some context, but that, also PFOS in use has gone down quite a bit over time. This is a more recent look at biosolids and PFAS in Michigan. And so PFOA would fall under this category. This is a group of PFAS compounds. Here's another group of compounds, and that would be PFOS. Sulfonamides, however, are what are known as PFAS precursors. So these have not been restricted quite as much. They are occurring in the biosolids at equal or higher rate than the PFOS, at least in this study. And that means that you can, yes, you still have PFOS going through, and you also have these compounds that either in the biosolids process, in composting or treatment, or in the soil afterwards are going to turn into PFOS. And people are just starting to kind of be catching up on this, right? We're sort of all catching up on what has happened.
You've got about 3 minutes, Caleb.
Oh boy. All right, we're gonna skip this one. The main take home is that it ends up in a leaf in the plant. Background levels, notice the yellow dots, that's where it's gonna be maybe 1 part per billion. If you know Vermont, that's where the more people are, more likely to be industry. Okay, into some composts. Here's like general backyard compost. Add in residential and commercial food waste and maybe serviceware, and you are a lot higher. Biosolids, 2 to 10 times higher than that. And the different colors represent different PFAS compounds. So it's a little bit of an oversimplification. Organization I work for, we have a big event. Feel free to come by in September. Generate a lot of waste. We're trying to be no waste. And so we mandate that food vendors use compostable materials. As you can imagine, it's not a very high-tech setup. This is very old compost that's been stockpiled, and we still are finding residue, right? So our volunteers who organize all this started separating food into one pile, food service materials into another. and co-composted with manure. Here's our big result. And this is the most contaminated compost that I'm aware of. And so this is an edge case, right? We're worst case scenario. Tons and tons of this food service material. And then the manure going with it, we did check clean. This little blip is actually probably a lab error. And then our food waste component, almost nothing. So clean food waste, clean manure from a farm that's not contaminated. And even if it was contaminated, not so much goes into the manure, depurates out of the animals through urine. Not a big deal. But when 2/3, or maybe, I forget the exact ratio by volume, but it was like a 2 to 3. When a big portion is food service materials, you can get some really high numbers of PFAS. So back to kind of why we care, our leaching to groundwater numbers, we're talking about 1 part per billion in the soil, or 17 parts per billion for another one. Those are really, that's like close to background levels, and we're worried about that's going to leach down into groundwater. Throw in a heavily contaminated compost, you're making it worse. Forages, the leafy part is the problem. If it's grass or hayland, we're like worried about 7 parts per billion. It might even be lower as those new values come down, but there's more information to be, more research needed. How much of that is actually the PFAS precursors in the soil? This is a recent study looking at compost when they're sampling it. The number on the left is a little weird, but basically that one line is saying what they sampled at the top of the pile and what they sampled 2 feet below the surface. If it's the same concentration, you're going to hit about that 1. The higher up you are, the more it is different because they're leaching through. Some of these different PFAS compounds, see, look, this is a ton, and that's hardly even scratching the surface of what they could be testing for if we had the standards. Some of them are leaching quite a bit. This is a really nice new paper. The different bars that you're seeing here are windrows and sampling from different ages of the compost as it's maturing. So when you first make your compost, the PFAS that we can look for, you maybe don't see that much. If you could look for the total organic fluorine, you would see a lot more. As it's composting, as it's breaking down, the PFAS are being liberated. And so then you can actually see them. And then this is showing the distribution, the relative abundance within that same group, right? It shouldn't be changing, except that they are being broken down from bigger compounds. Some of this is also, as you're composting, you're concentrating, right? So some things are going to be going up for that reason, but you're also liberating from these compounds that you can't test for very easily, and you're also potentially leaching and having some losses. Some of the conclusions were that we could be underestimating PFAS concentrations in municipal solid waste compost by 40 to 160 fold. That's huge. And then the leachability based soil screening thresholds that they were looking at, they were using different ones than Maine has. Basically that they were producing compost quickly from this one site that they were using that would exceed that leachability concern. One thing to keep in mind also is that in this study, the composter they were working with, as soon as they got like the initial results, they were like, well, we're going to have people pull those materials out of the pile, out of this, right at source separation. Well, not sort, as delivered separation. Mm-hmm. That helped. It only helped, it either helped by 40% or 60%. Anyway, it's close enough to only taking out about half, because in that big barrel of compost and stuff, there was a lot of mixing going on, and the PFAS were migrating already into the food waste. Biosolids show similar things, just another study here, and that basically a composting treatment or a heat treatment, you are actually seeing increases of certain types of PFAS compounds. But to be fair, not all of these products are the same. There are some standards. So everything on here that says FCM is a food contact material. The ones that have like no spots means there were no PFAS detected by this study. The ones that have many spots means many different types, and the closer to red and that really dark red, the greater the quantity. So there's some that are very high, some that are maybe not. And it's unfortunately, until that's really well regulated or something, it's going to be very difficult to know. There are some standards. They have been in place only since 2020. So some of these may have been including things that were previous to those standards. They maybe were not participating. And that's what concerns me, is that you can have a voluntary certification. BPI can say, this is our standard. But if we have trained our consumers to want something that looks compostable and they think it's compostable, they maybe aren't going to know if it is meeting those standards alone or not. And last bit.
Okay, go ahead.
They cling to bits in the soil, organic matter, clay, and those are the parts that are going to stick to your hands. This is my hand. I know what happens, right? And it's also maybe what's going to go airborne. So just from a personal exposure of you, your workers, or your customers, you might actually be getting an even heavier dose because they're concentrated in the organic matter fractions. And if anybody needs to reach me.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Caleb. So many bits, but we only have a few minutes. We did have a couple questions come in for you, Caleb, specifically. You touched on this a little bit, but the 2022 was pre-BPI limit on fluorinated compounds before that was fully implemented. So it seems from the data that you showed that that might make a difference as food packaging cleans up its act, then hopefully we'll be seeing less in there. And that also, I just want to give a nod, if folks here were not in our last session, we did talk a little bit about the need for more federal regulation for those lookalikes and the green, people who want to jump on the compostable bandwagon but aren't necessarily certified or following through, and just confusing the situation even more than it needs to be. John Culpepper did ask if in human excrement if the PFAS, PFAS, PFOS concentrations is higher in the solid or the liquid fraction.
Liquid fraction, and that's why it's associated with kidney cancer. Your kidneys are what's getting it to slowly leave your body. Great.
Any other questions from the participants in the room here?
While that's maybe getting generated, a question or two. The BPI standard is a really good start. No intentionally added PFAS. I'm not sure how far that goes back in terms of a supply stream for a manufacturer. I just don't know that. But the verification is really just that it's testing below 100 parts per million, I believe, total organic fluorine. And total organic fluorine is not equivalent to just like summing all PFAS. There's other ways it can get in there. But if there's recycled paper fibers, they could be bringing PFAS with them. 100 parts per million is, when we're talking about parts per billion and parts per trillion, it's potentially incredibly permissive. So it's not necessarily as far as it needs to go at some point, but it's a step in the right direction for sure.
Yeah, for sure. Carrie was asking whether PFAS could be absorbed through the skin, like from dirt.
There is some examples of that. I don't know. It's probably compound by compound and what it's co-occurring with. I don't know if anybody's looked at from soil directly. But it's definitely been looked at a little bit for like personal care products.
Yeah, and also, I don't know, this was a few years ago, but I know Andrew Carpenter had been talking about like in those McDonald's wrappers, just the, skin contact from that type of material there has been some evidence for direct absorption, right?
Yeah. Most concerning though, typically is ingestion.
Yeah. Yeah. Which we do. So, so things to think about. I guess we do that with dirt and potentially compost and compost particles as well. So many interesting threads. I think I'm going to have all three of you back for compost conversation where we have more time to get into dialogue and discussion after the summit. But thank you all for sharing your expertise. I wish we had more time, and we'll be looking to carve out some more time for that, but really interesting presentations. A quick reminder for folks who are coming back at 3:30 this afternoon, we have the Haulers Roundtable. And a lot of these threads are sort of falling together here, right? So we're going to be talking about the Haulers Roundtable is really focused on effective source separation. And so I love the distinction of like, is it source separation at the source or is it source separation at the facility? Those are actually two different things. And so many of the threads from this morning's session and this session that we're just concluding now will be picked up and continued opportunities to dialogue on that as the day continues. So hopefully some of you will be able to join us back at 3:30 this afternoon. Thank you all so much for coming and sharing in this learning with us. There's a lot more to learn, and we hope you'll keep coming back.